Good afternoon and good morning again for all of us joining us from Singapore. Good morning and good afternoon to those joining us from Europe. We have a little bit of an audio interference, so maybe we could mute the microphones. Thank you very much. My name is Hannes Schlömann, Director of WTO Advisors. I have the pleasure and privilege of being the moderator of today's webinar. Today's event is organized by the EU delegation to Singapore as part of a policy support facility project on the implementation of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, or EUSFTA, and co-sponsored by the Ministry of Trade and Industry of Singapore and Eurochamp Singapore. Allow me therefore to welcome you all again on behalf of the European Union delegation and the co-sponsors very warmly to today's webinar on trade in electronics under the EU-Singapore FTA. This is the latest in a series of outreach webinars on the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, which has now been in force a little over 2 years. We're honored to have with us again a very interesting panel of speakers whom I will introduce in due course. But before I get there, a few housekeeping reminders for everyone. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the EU delegation's website and YouTube channel. Those who registered for the webinar will receive an email with the respective links to the recording and the presentations. We would like to encourage you to share your questions during the webinar and take this opportunity to actively interact with the experts on screen. For this, please use the Q&A tab in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen, rather than the chat function. And for those of you posting comments to social media, please remember to use the hashtag EUSFTA. If you do have comments other than questions, feel free to put these into the chat, of course. In fact, trade negotiators greatly appreciate feedback. While this is not a consultation, your spontaneous input is indeed most welcome. Allow me now to welcome the European Union Ambassador to Singapore, Her Excellency Ivona Pjorko. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Hello. Hi, do you hear me well?
Yes.
So indeed, it's my pleasure again to be in this series of very useful webinars. I say as you, very good morning to colleagues from Europe and good afternoon to those in Singapore. Looking through my window, I don't know what's the weather in Europe, but if it's the one I remember, which is at this time of the year rather gloomy and rainy, for once you don't have to envy us in Singapore because we are also under very heavy rain since a couple of hours. And jokes apart, today's subject is indeed, I understand, attracting a lot of attention for very good reasons. We've done quite a number already on various sectors. These are all webinars on trade, as you just said, under the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, organized by delegation, our delegation and colleagues. Today's subject is electronics. I will at least answer 2 of your poll questions during my short welcoming words. I couldn't do it myself because it was prohibited for speakers, but I figured out those on the first page. So I'm really very happy to have with us today so many experts, companies, stakeholders that can, through such occasions, post questions and comments and exchange on the benefits and opportunities of our free trade agreement. As I usually say in these webinars, let me repeat, because the audience changes each time, at least to some extent, that as everybody knows, we are really very solid trade and investment partners, Singapore and European Union. And our annual bilateral trade in goods and services is over 100 billion euro, making Singapore our largest trade partner in Southeast Asia. And the same goes for our top destination for foreign direct investment in the Asean region. And we work with Singapore not only bilaterally, but obviously also multilaterally. We are both strong believers in multilateralism, health of WTO, etc., where we are very much aligned and working together on the reform. Now, coming very briefly, really, to the subject of today, trade in electrical machinery and equipment represents a very significant part of our bilateral trade relations. And here comes the answer to the, I think, first question of your poll. It is 5.7 billion euro in 2020, at least. So it was the last answer. And indeed, the products that are included there are from a very wide range, from electronic integrated circuits to electronic household and consumer goods. And for this very reason, because it is an important area, we have even a specific annex on electronics that probably most of you know within the chapter of technical barriers to trade under FTA. And there comes another answer to your poll. One of the issues that is included in this annex and is very important is regards conformity assessment procedures, and basically the issue how to eliminate those burdensome procedures that sometimes keep us from fostering bilateral trade. And we had actually the very first Trade in Goods Committee last September, where amongst others this issue, the annex of electronics, was looked to and its implementation was reviewed. So without further ado, I leave the floor to experts and those that know best the area for you to exchange. This is indeed, we hope, a unique opportunity to interact and to make it really useful for all of you. I wish you all therefore a useful morning or afternoon, depending where you are, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for these remarks. And yes, I think we're onto something quite important here. Electronics is underpinning just about everything, as we heard also just yesterday with the semiconductors story coming out of Europe. Let us take a quick moment to perhaps look at the poll results. I wanted to see, here we are. So obviously doing this at the very beginning means many people don't have the time to do this, and it's just an indicator. So the initial poll indicated that people were guessing the volume was 1 to 3 billion annually rather than more than 5 billion, as we just heard. The second question was, what are the main challenges in exporting electronics from the EU to Singapore? And here, difficult technical regulations was 25% of the answers. Differences in technical regulations, 50%. So the classical TBT divide, if you like. But there was also some emphasis on duplication of procedures. Third question, the same question, but the other way around. What happens when you export electronics from Singapore to the EU? Here, tariffs and taxes, which we lump together for the purpose of this question, still play a role, at least in the minds of people. Technical regulations, again, and the difference in technical regulation comes out a little bit more prominently than the difficulty of technical regulations per se, but also conformity assessment procedures here come up more prominently, if I can say. Has it become easier to import electronics into Singapore? Yes, and yes. So everybody thinks it has become easier. Jun Hong, I believe, will be happy to hear that. We'll see how that plays out later. And the last question was, in your view, does the EUSFTA help in facilitating fostering trade in electronics and telecoms equipment between the EU and Singapore? It helps a lot, 25%, not sure, or no, 75%. Now, that I think may require some reflection, but perhaps it is that the developments that happened have to do with the EUSFTA, but are not attributed to the EUSFTA, something we might want to reflect on perhaps as we move forward. So now I would say, let us go to our substantive sessions. My colleague Eugene Lim, an international trade and tax lawyer with WTS Excise Asia and team leader of our EUD support project, will give us a brief overview of EU-Singapore trade and investment in electronics. Our second session then zooms in on the EUSFTA Electronics Annex, which the ambassador alluded to earlier, the Singapore regulatory framework for electronics and telecoms equipment, the international standards framework, and the WTO context, and asks what contribution does the EUSFTA to make to cutting red tape. The speakers in that session are Luis Miguel Vega Fidalgo from the European Commission's DG GROW, an expert on the electronic sector, Mr. Jun Hong Yap, Senior Assistant Director at the MTI's International Trade Cluster, James Losari, a lawyer and legal expert in the projects here, providing external support to the implementation of the EUSFTA to the EU delegation, and Dennis Chu, Regional Director, Asia Pacific at the International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC, and he's based in Singapore as well. This will then be followed by a reflection on industry perspectives of the EUSFTA on electronics trade with or via Singapore and the electronics industry in Singapore. Our designated speakers there are Dr. Wolfgang Weber, the CEO of Zwei, the German Electro and Digital Industry Association, and Chris Southworth, co-chair of the Legal Reform Advisory Group within the ICC Digital Standards Initiative. We will close with an outlook both into the region and supply chains. Welcome to all, and thank you to all dear speakers. Now for our first session, over to you, Eugene.
Thank you very much, Hannes, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. So I would like to, in the next 10 minutes or so, provide you with an overview of the landscape for trade in electronics in Singapore and the bilateral trading relationships with the EU, and hopefully that will lay the groundwork and tee up a fruitful discussion for the following speakers. So today, I'd like to touch on 2 points. Firstly, sizing the electronics market in ASEAN, and I think it's important always to look at Singapore as being a landing point, an entry point into a wider region, and that wider region could either be Southeast Asia or even the Asia Pacific region. And it's important to bear that in mind because obviously Singapore is a very small nation state and the market here itself is very small, but if viewed as a gateway into the region, then we are looking at a much larger market, a much larger catchment area for consumers and customers. Then we'll look at trade and investments in electronics between the EU and Singapore. And again, there I'll present a few statistical data to provide you a sense as to where we are and also provide you a sense as to where directionally Singapore is looking to grow and develop the electronics industry. So firstly, let's look at an overview of Singapore's electronics industry. Certainly, I think Singapore has a rich and diverse manufacturing hub, notwithstanding the fairly small landmass here in Singapore. The government here continues to ensure that a good percentage of our GDP is still manufacturing based. And again, on an annual basis, we have over $300 billion of manufacturing industry output. And this is approximately 30% of this, of Singapore's manufacturing output stems from the electronics industry. So the electronics industry is certainly very important anchor to the manufacturing activity in Singapore. Singapore, I think in the semiconductor global supply chain plays an important node, both as an area for foundries and semiconductor manufacturers for them where they're located, as well as equipment manufacturers. So if you look at the various types of players in this ecosystem, you include some of the largest foundries, both proprietary and contract manufacturing semiconductor foundries, suppliers to the semiconductor industry, so the consumables, but also you have many of the large semiconductor equipment manufacturers that have significant operations here in Singapore or in the surrounding region. And some of the companies in this space with a significant presence in Singapore include Infineon, Global Foundries, Siltronics, Kulik and Sofa, Applied Materials, etc. Now, in terms of where Singapore intends to grow the electronics industry, certainly the electronics industry continues to be a strategic industry for Singapore, and Singapore has an industry roadmap for the electronics industry, and this the execution and the of this industry, the development execution of the industry roadmap development in many ways is worked on by numerous different government agencies, but including the Economic Development Board. And there you have three pillars to developing the electronics industry in the roadmap. Firstly, to transform and grow, and to continue to attract and anchor high value added manufacturing activities in Singapore. And in Singapore, because of the small land mass, it's important to ensure that the type of manufacturing activities that is set up in Singapore is able to command the value add premium to justify the use of resources and locating that operation in Singapore. Secondly, to boost productivity with adoption of robotics and automation, and you'll see that companies and that invest in Singapore and which intend to incur significant expense to improve productivity through automation, robotics, and other forms of innovation. There you get good grant support from the Singapore government to assist companies that intend to engage in these pursuits. Thirdly, certainly the Singapore government continues to support companies to undertake advanced manufacturing innovation. And there certainly Industry 4.0 and those developments there clearly resonate with a lot of the policy decisions that are being undertaken by the Singapore government. Secondly, the second pillar is really to diversify the electronics industry, and there to diversify into new growth markets, looking at new types of electronic players to bring into the Singapore economy, and really there to strengthen the innovation ecosystem and to harness new growth opportunities in the electronics industry. And really the hallmark here is to look at positioning Singapore as an innovation hub for new products and solutions, and to grow the diversity of players in the electronics industry here in Singapore. The third pillar to develop the electronics industry is through partnerships with trade associations and chambers of commerce. And I think you'll see that there have been a lot of initiatives around EV charging, and to ensure that we continue to, the Singapore government works with industry to ensure that you have the right kind of infrastructure to support the growth of EVs in Singapore. Now, if we look at trade statistics between the EU and Singapore, in 2020, the exports from Singapore to the EU was approximately 1.67 billion euros, and the imports from the EU was approximately 2.96 billion euros. And these goods comprised of electronic data processing and office equipment, telco equipment, and integrated circuits and electronic components, reflecting really the industrial needs and the type of production that you find in Singapore as well as in the Singapore market. Now, as I mentioned, it's important to look at Singapore in the context of, in a wider context, and the context of the region where Singapore exists in. And here we've included some, again, some data points in relation to Singapore's role as a gateway nation into the ASEAN region. If you look at trade in electronics in ASEAN, the electronics sector accounts for between 20 to 50% of the total value of exports of most ASEAN countries. Certainly, you've got countries in Southeast Asia that play an important role in the global electronics supply chain. Certainly, you have Thailand that has really developed its disk drive manufacturing industry to command a fairly sizable percentage of global supply in disk drives. And there are many other examples of these type of industries, but certainly you have a lot of the world's largest consumer electronic companies have significant operations in the ASEAN region, including European multinationals like Philips, Electrolux, Schneider Electric, etc. They have massive operations in the region. There are also a wide range of incentives available to encourage the development of new technologies, as well as to provide regional and international headquarters services from Singapore. But I will also add that apart from Singapore, if you're looking to set up significant manufacturing in many of the countries in Southeast Asia, there would also be fairly attractive incentives for investments in those areas. And thirdly, Singapore really acting as a gateway to ASEAN, and there, apart from some of the global manufacturing that we've mentioned in the semiconductor space, you'll see that Singapore is often used also as an important node in the distribution of electronic goods in ASEAN, taking advantage of its strong logistics infrastructure, as well as its port and airport type of connectivity. So with that, I think I wanted to bring all of us on a whistle-stop tour of Singapore and Singapore's role in the electronics industry, both on a bilateral basis with the EU, but also as a gateway into ASEAN. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Hannes, for the next segment of the program.
Thank you so much, Eugene, for this quite informative tour de force. I heard a number of terms that we will probably hear again, including innovation, which of course permeates almost everything. I also heard services in this context, in the integration between production, investment, services. You mentioned headquarter services, for example, but we could go into any part of this value chain and discover a great number of services. As we speak about goods, we need to think about services. And lastly, of course, the degree of integration in various shapes and configurations that we're looking at, a fast-moving, fast-evolving landscape here. So thank you very much for this introduction. Without further ado, let me turn to our next speaker. Luis Miguel, the European Commission champions the cause of the electronics industry in its EU FTAs. And for a good reason, of course, the Singapore FTA is a landmark here, and we're here to celebrate it today. So thank you very much in advance for sharing some of your insights. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannes. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm going to try to be brief and not to take a long time to give a quick overview on the annex on electronics of the FTA between the European Union and Singapore. Let me just give you some information, some general information about the objectives of the agreement, of the free trade agreement. I'm going to focus on some relevant aspects in my view. The first one is to try to prevent non-tariff barriers for bilateral trade. And how can we do it? Basically, trusting in relevant international standards that are used in order to demonstrate compliance with the regulations in both territories. We also need to work towards reducing the burdens, the administrative burdens for manufacturers and economic operators on conformity assessment procedures. And of course, working on a continuous cooperation between both authorities, the European Union and Singapore authorities. With respect to the annex on electronics, we have to say that the scope is on electrical and electronic equipment, electrical household appliances, and consumer electronics. As you can see, there are a lot of different categories of products and equipment, including here. Not only from the consumer side, but also from the industrial side. This is very relevant in both territories. And let me also anticipate something that is relevant for us, which is that more and more these categories of equipment include wireless capabilities. We have washing machines with Wi-Fi modules. We have traditional household appliances with wireless capabilities. And this is very relevant from the side of the European Union because the regulations will be different, as I am going to explain in a minute. The pillars in which the Electronic Annex is based on are basically standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment procedures, as I said before, based on those international standards. That is why the alignment with international standards is so necessary. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because it was clearly explained by our previous speaker. The trade flows in Singapore are, as you can see here, there is quite a relevant reduction on the imports from the European Union, and the exports have been maintained in the last 2-3 years. If we look into a bit of detail, we can see that the more, let's say, more stable products in terms of trading is from electrical machinery. And if we focus on electronic processing equipment, telecom equipment, and integrated circuits, in this case, we see the biggest difference. Well, I would like to give you a quick overview on the different on the legal framework in the European Union applicable to this kind of products. Basically, we have 3 different legislations, 3 different pieces of legislations in Europe: the Electromagnetic Compatibility Directive, the Low Voltage Directive, and the Radio Equipment Directive. What is important to understand here is that for products that don't have wireless capabilities, the EMCD, the Electromagnetic Compatibility Directive, and the LVD applies. The purpose of those directives is basically to ensure certain level of electromagnetic compatibility and to protect the health and the safety of the users. However, if the product includes wireless capabilities via different technologies such as 5G, cellular network technologies, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, whatever, then the Radio Equipment Directive applies. So what is important to understand is that if the Radio Equipment Directive applies, which is more and more present because, as I said before, more and more products include these capabilities, then the other pieces of legislation do not apply. And radio equipment we can define it as equipment with purposes of radio communication or radio determination. So we are not talking only about communication, but also equipment with purposes of geolocalization, for example, sensors, etc. This is also very important in the industry, from the industry perspective, in advanced manufacturing, Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, and so on. The requirements imposed by this piece of legislation in Europe are basically safety, electromagnetic compatibility, so it encompasses the previous requirements from the other 2 directives, and also the protection of radio spectrum in order to avoid harmful interferences for radio services. I would like also to draw your attention, maybe we can go back to the previous slide, please. Thank you. We have recently activated 2 further requirements. This is very relevant for the industry. The radio equipment will have to fulfill with 2 different requirements in the future. First of all is the capability of smartphones to use the Galileo-based geolocalization system for accessing emergency services. This is something that will be applicable as of March 2022, so next month. And another very relevant point is cybersecurity. The European Commission has recently adopted a delegated act, a new piece of legislation on cybersecurity, privacy and protection from fraud, which will be applicable to a number of categories of radio equipment, and whose purpose is basically that the radio equipment incorporate features that ensure network resilience, that enhance the privacy of the users, and that protects from monetary fraud. This will be applicable in 3 years, from in 2 years and a half, better said, from August 2024. As I said before, the standards are one of the key points here. The agreement is based on international recognized organizations such as ISO, IEC, or ITU. We have to say that approximately 80% of the standards used in the European Union market are based on these standards. So the European Union is working towards adopting this kind of standards as harmonized standards. This is something we will talk a bit later on, but harmonized standards are those adopted at European Union level, and they provide with presumption of conformity to the legal requirements. So this is very important to understand, that when a manufacturer uses a harmonized standard applicable in Europe, this standard will provide to him or to her with presumption of conformity with the legal requirements. So this is highly recommended by our side. We need to continuously improve the technical regulations in order to avoid barriers to trade, in order to avoid that different standards or different technical regulations will be necessary in order, of course, to avoid any excessive administrative burdens. The preferred formula we have for electromagnetic compatibility and for safety is the simplest one, which is the Supplier's Declaration of Conformity and Market Surveillance. So we need to try to avoid, as much as we can, third-party conformity assessment, certification assessment based on public authorities or notified bodies. This is something that is not the main objective. We need to simplify. We need to go through let's say, to the self-assessment conformity procedures, because it's the easiest way. And of course, we need to try any kind of registration of products. In the European Union, we don't request any registration of products for any categories of electronic equipment. Well, with respect to the conformity assessment, which is one of the pillars of this free trade agreement on the particular case of electronics, in the case of Singapore, third-party certification, which I said is not the preferred option, is only required for certain categories of products that are listed in the free trade agreement. But in any case, this list is subject to continuous revision under a risk assessment in order to obviously to reduce it as much as we can. Singapore will accept lab tests issued by some specific laboratories recognized. I'm not going to go into much detail, but any recognized lab, ILA accredited lab, or labs that are that have subscribed a voluntary arrangement with the conformity assessment bodies will be accepted by Singapore to place products on their market. With respect to the case in Europe, we have to say that we have two possibilities, self-assessment and a third-party conformity assessment. Both of them are allowed. But what is important to understand is that third-party conformity assessment, the non-preferred option, is only mandatory when radio equipment, this is only necessary for radio equipment, nor for electronic equipment which don't have radio capabilities, wireless capabilities. In this case, it's only mandatory when radio equipment does not use, the manufacturer has not used harmonized standards to demonstrate compliance. So this is why, again, it's so important to use harmonized standards, standards based on international organizations, on recognized international organization, because in this case, the manufacturer does not need to use third-party conformity assessment. And as I said again, and I would like to stress it, harmonized standards in support of these pieces of legislation will provide with presumption of conformity to the legal requirements. So it means that towards the market surveillance authorities, the member states in the European Union, they can demonstrate that they fulfill with the legal requirements. I stop here. I would like to thanks very much to the audience and to the organization for letting me present this overview on the Annex on Electronics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis Miguel. This was another tour de force through what is reasonably complex, but you brought us to the main themes here, and somewhat linking back to the initial poll questions. The emphasis on procedure is significant here. You stressed the desire to go for maximum simplification, if I can simplify as much. And within this, the model, the preferred European model of self-declaration and market surveillance. Another thing that I heard was also this vision into the future, which in electronics is perhaps even more important than anywhere else. And the growing themes like cybersecurity require a lot of attention, and then integration into instruments such as the Annex, which was negotiated quite a few years ago, actually. Without further comments from my side, let me turn over to Junhong Yap. Junhong, electronics are, of course, as we heard already today, a key sector for both industry and trade in Singapore. Let me add again the notion of services here. We're thus very keen to hear from you and what the MTIs or your take as the MTI is here on this sector and on the question before us when it comes to trade with the European Union. Junhong, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannes. Good morning and afternoon to everyone joining in from Europe or from Singapore. Very honored to be able to speak at this webinar and to join the very distinguished panel of speakers here. Just to highlight my appreciation first to the ambassador as well as the EU delegation for organizing this event, and then also for all of you participants out there for sparing your time to avail yourself for this event. I had actually intended to start off giving a brief overview of the electronic industry and things like that, but I think Eugene did a very good job for us, highlighting, that the electronic industry is actually one of the key manufacturing sectors in Singapore, which I would like to think that is common knowledge to all of us. In 2020 itself, I think the industry contributed near to half of our manufacturing output. I recorded more than 6.5 billion in fixed asset investment during the same period. There's also about half of the total FAI that the manufacturing sectors have attracted in 2020. I don't want to delve too deeply into this because I think Eugene has provided very, very good overview. And also the next point is really about how we don't want to see ourselves in isolation, but to believe that our role goes beyond just serving ourselves. In fact, like what Eugene said, we see ourselves as a keynote in the global electronics supply chain. So to supplement what Eugene has shared, I actually have some figures, in terms of the trade in the final and intermediate electronic goods from Singapore, the export to the ASEAN region. If you can look, based on the OECD data in 2018, actually Singapore is ranked one of the top economies, exporting final and intermediate electronic goods to the ASEAN region. So we primarily serve as a node for distribution of electronic goods towards the ASEAN region. And we always wanted to position ourselves as a gateway for companies to come through Singapore to access the greater ASEAN market and ASEAN region, as what Eugene has mentioned just now. Now, Eugene mentioned about industrial policy and how we have deliberate industrial policy, to ensure that we can build, develop, and further strengthen our electronic sector. I would like to share a bit about the trade approaches that we have been taking to actually complement the industrial policy that we have put in place. And the three key approaches that we have put in place, which we believe are relevant and helpful for the electronic supply chain and the businesses out there is, first, I think we have an almost tariff-free regime. with the exception of certain alcoholic products. So what this means is that all types of electronic goods, be it final product or components, can be traded through Singapore in and out tariff-free. This helps to lower the business and manufacturing costs of producing and trading such electronic goods through Singapore. For electronic supply chain, it can be rather fragmented. You have certain operations doing certain components in certain markets. Having that free trade regime allowing you to import and export components to make them into the final products. Having this tariff-free regime, I believe, greatly help to the businesses in terms of their global electronic supply chain. Second part, or the second approach that we have, is that we have a reliable and consistent trade regime. So what this means is that we do not impose border control, we do not impose any export or import prohibition or restriction on the trade of electronic goods. As a matter of fact, it's also not for any kind of good. In the face of the supply crunch recently, even during the COVID situation, Singapore has maintained an open and free trade regime to ensure, that Singapore is a reliable and actually a resilient investment location for your supply chain network. And thirdly, of course, the key of what we are speaking today, we have an extensive network of FTAs. We are involved in the RCEP, we are involved in CPTPP, various ASEAN +1 FTAs for you to assess the ASEAN market. We have big FTA with the EU. This means that companies can tap on this FTA to gain preferential market access to other markets within the region, as well as globally. And in the lights of the EU-Sing FTA, I believe that this helps to ensure the conducive and open trade environment between the businesses, EU, as well as Singapore's operations, especially if you have business activities in both markets. To highlight a bit about the EU-Singapore trade, I think this was also briefly mentioned by Eugene and also as well as Luis Miguel. In fact, more than 40% of EU-Singapore trade in 2021 is centered around electronic goods, which is reflective of the importance of the industry to trade between both destinations. And we have seen trade increase over the years, rising even during the COVID pandemic period, and which really shows the strength of the trade in electronic goods between both destinations. I have mentioned about the kind of tariff regime that we have, how we actually enhance and facilitate trade of electronic goods between the EU and Singapore by having certain tariff measures. We also have non-tariff measures. Luis Miguel shared about that. What is special about the EU-Sing FTA besides the tariff commitments is also the Electronic Annex that we have agreed under the Technical Barriers to Trade chapter. I know it covers the standards, technical regulations, conformity assessment procedures for certain household electronic products, as well as certain telecommunication electronic products. And I don't want to delve too deeply into this again. I think Luis Miguel did a very good job, explaining what the annex has, it contains, what it comprises, what it hopes to achieve. The main intent is to cut regulatory red tape, make it simpler for companies to trade electronic goods across both markets without too complex of a requirement, without additional requirement that may not be in line with international standards and practices. But like what Luis Miguel has said, there is certain exception where we maintain for a very narrow scope of household electronic goods, which we still maintain the requirement of having third-party certification. And the idea is really to safeguard consumer safety in Singapore. But we are always like what Luis Miguel said, we are always reviewing the annexes, or rather the regulation that we have in place for household electronic products, to find ways in which we can simplify the procedures or even remove certain categories from this third-party certification to make it easier for companies to actually trade or rather export their household electronic goods to Singapore. And the next slide that I will share about is actually the regulations that we have put in place. So within Singapore, we have the Consumer Protection Safety Requirements Regulations, or the CPSR in short. And as I mentioned, the whole idea is not to make trade difficult, but the whole intent, or the primary intent and the starting point, is to ensure that we safeguard consumer safety, especially for household electronics. I mean, Singapore is very small compared to the EU. in terms of population density, in terms of how we live, we have 10, 20 stories of HDB flats, and around Singapore, most families are actually living in HDB flats. So to us, household electronic is a key element of our household, and it is paramount for us to ensure the safety of this product, to make sure that the whole environment is safe. That we don't have any incidents where it can cause certain damages to property or even lives, which can be quite extensive, given how we stay and how dense we are actually co-located with each other. So the CPSR requires certain categories of household electronics, as well as gas appliances and accessories, to be tested to specified safety standards, registered with the authorities, and affixed with the safety mark before they can be sold in Singapore. And the registration is based on a certificate of conformity issued by designated third-party conformity assessment bodies, or supplier declaration of conformity declared by registered suppliers. At the start of the whole presentation, I think Hannes did share the result of the poll, where it says that most of the companies and most of you actually feel that there is an improvement in terms of trading electronic goods through Singapore and things like that. And I'm heartened to hear that, because I think as part of the EU-Singapore FTA, we are committed to constantly review, and in an attempt to try to bring down the number of product categories that require third-party certification under the CPSR. If I could just share very briefly what has happened throughout the years, in the course of our negotiation of the EU-Sing FTA, actually prior to the EU-Sing FTA, we have about 41 product categories that is on the CPSR. As part of the entry into force of the EU-Sing FTA, we removed 3 product categories from the requirements of these third-party certifications. We removed that from the CPSR. And in the 2018 review, we further removed 2 product categories to a post-market surveillance regime, and 4 product categories was moved to the supplier declaration of conformity regime. And as what Luis Miguel said, is really the most basic and simple kind of regime to ensure safety standards are met and the consumer safety are protected. So in a sense, we have, as part of the EU-Sing FTA, in a way to ensure that it's simpler and more facilitative for companies to trade such consumer goods. We have undertaken certain efforts to try to bring down the kind of requirements and obligations that we impose on companies. And to hear that, some of the panel or some of the poll feedback has said that, you do feel that there is a enhanced facilitation in terms of the trade. I'm heartened to hear that. And I think this is an area we will constantly work with our EU counterparts at a government-to-government level, at the entity level, to really try to assess, how can we make it even simpler, or even make it more facilitative for companies to actually trade their electronic goods to Singapore. And I think with that, I've come to the end of my sharing, and I would like to pass it back to Hannes, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John Hong. Yes, a lot of additional food for thought here. The slide with the complementary approaches, as simple as it was, visualizes quite nicely what underlies some quite complex work. And what you also stressed was the fact that this is work in progress, and it requires continuous work, which is in fact recognized in the Electronics Annex. As well. Progress is also signified with this slide that we're still seeing. I see video cassette recorders. Things become obsolete, new things come up, and that means you have your work cut out. Everybody's dealing with electronics and electronics trade here. James, you will share a few additional observations here on electronics regulation in Singapore, not least again in light of the EUSFTA. And perhaps also take a quick side look at the WTO, which was already mentioned earlier today. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored to participate in this discussion with the distinguished speakers. Basically, my presentation we'll really focus on two things. First, I will look into a legal analysis on the trade in electronics, mainly focusing on the WTO TBT agreement and the advancement made under the EU-Singapore FTA. And secondly, I will look into Singapore's compliance with the provisions inside the EUSFTA. So to begin with, I think it is important to start with the context, and Eugene as well as Junhong have helpfully provided a very comprehensive context of how trade in electronics constitutes a significant portion of Singapore's trade in goods. So I will not go further into that, but what I want to focus is really into how among, besides being a global supply chain, a part of the global supply chain in electronic trade, Singapore also imports electronic products for domestic consumption. And lately, of these products which are being imported, as Junhong mentioned earlier, there are certain concerns about the safety. So in fact, if we look at in January 2022, actually there have been several reported incidents related to electronic products. Therefore, there is really a need for certain standards to ensure safety and harmonization of the standards. While it is recognized that standards are important and needed, states also recognize that standards could become technical barriers to trade. And that is why in the WTO level, we see the so-called WTO agreement, WTO's TBT agreement, which ensures that when states take certain technical regulations or adopt certain regulations on standards as well as conformity assessment procedures, they are done in a non-discriminatory manner. And also, these regulations or procedures do not create unnecessary obstacles to trade. And so that's basically the principles we find in the TBT agreement. And also the TBT agreement specifies that when there are certain international standards applicable, then member states should basically adopt that international standards into their technical regulations, except if there are certain legitimate policy objectives that make them want to adopt or deviate from the international standards. So now the EU-Singapore FTA goes beyond what is provided in the WTO TBT agreement. It basically seeks to facilitate trade even further and not let technical barriers become hurdles for industry. And I want to focus on three main parts where the EUSFTA introduces this advancement, I think. First is in terms of good regulatory practice. Of course, this is provided in the TBT agreement, but the EU-Singapore FTA basically affirms the importance of adopting certain good regulatory practice for adoptions of technical regulations and standards to ensure that there are certain industry feedback as well being involved in the adoption process. As regards to conformity assessment procedures, this has been discussed in a very comprehensive manner by both Junhong as well as Luis Miguel, that in principle, the procedures should be avoided under the EUSFTA, and therefore, there's an encouragement to use more of suppliers' declaration of conformity and post-market surveillance mechanisms. Marking and labeling, the EUSFTA goes beyond what the TBT agreement in the WTO provides, in the way that it specifies the conditions when a country requires certain mandatory marking or labeling. For example, there's a condition that where there's such a requirement is being imposed, then the country should still allow information in other languages to be in the labels, in addition to the language required in the importing party. So besides the general TBT rules in Annex 4A electronics, there are more regulations which are meant to facilitate trade in electronics. I will not deal with this in greater detail, but one point that I want to emphasize a little bit more is regarding international standards. So there is an addition of an international standardizing body, which is mentioned in the EUSFTA, but not in the WTO TBT agreement, and that is the International Telecommunications Union. I think that is quite interesting, especially with the development in technology. And in fact, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we heard the news in the US where there are some major airliners who decided to cancel their flights in light of the United States plans to roll out new 5G antennas nearby the airports. And the main reason really being because the spectrum used for the 5G antennas is very close to the radar altimeters, and that might interfere with the safety of navigation of these aircrafts. So here it just really shows how important to have an international standardizing body which determines certain international standards that should be adopted or should be considered by states. I will now progress to the second part of my presentation, which is really the crux of the presentation about Singapore's compliance with the EUSFTA. And I want to focus on 4 major points here. First, as regards the preparation of technical regulations, I mentioned earlier about good regulatory practice. And in fact, Singapore has complied with this. If we look at in the preparation process for adoption of technical regulations or technical references in Singapore, there is a constant public consultation in the development of those regulations or references by taking into account industry feedback. In terms of conformity assessment procedures, Singapore relies on SDOC for most electronic products except those falling under the exception in the Annex 4A. Singapore has also designated some EU-based conformity assessment bodies. It also recognized the results of conformity assessment procedures in the EU by recognized testing labs, as what Luis Miguel had explained earlier. So the other point that I want to focus is really on the exception, the control goods that the regime, CPSR regime that Jun Hong has explained. So from our study, we did see that Singapore has reduced the categories of products. So now the products is only 33 categories compared to 45 categories previously. However, what we found from the textual analysis there are 2 categories which involve products which are not actually included in the EUSFTA exceptions. And those are hair care appliances, because if you look at the exception, it only covers hair dryers, as well as other lamp control gears besides ballast for tubular fluorescent lamps. While textually there seems to be non-compliance here, but in practice, we have not seen any complaint raised by the industry. The last point that I want to look into is marking and labeling. I think Singapore, from the study, Singapore has complied with the requirements. There's no requirement for labels to be approved by the authorities prior to its placement in the market. And one of the example of labeling requirement is the safety mark label that has to be affixed on controlled goods which are circulated in Singapore. And in order to ensure compliance, Singapore is conducting market surveillance. So way forward under the EUSFTA, there are 2 things that I observed. One, there's the periodical review that Jun Hong has mentioned earlier. This is expressly regulated under the EUSFTA. And the next one will happen in 2024. That is 5 years after the entry into force of the agreement, with a view to reduce the number of control goods which will be subject to third-party assessment. And also, with the cooperation between the EU and Singapore under the EUSFTA, there are several cooperation provisions. Hopefully, there are more harmonized standards and technical regulations, as well as conformity assessment procedures, which will help to integrate more EU and Singapore products into the global production chains of electronics. That will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. thank you also for stressing the important role that international standardization plays. That allows me to flip over with really nothing further, other than to say that, of course, Dennis, the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission, is the international standard setter when it comes to electronics. The role of the ITU was stressed just now. And as such, the IEC is prominently referenced in the EUSFTA Annex on electronics. You will now give us a better idea what the organization does. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Hannes. And it's really a pleasure for me to join all of you here at this webinar. It's very interesting that we hear from different perspectives. When I work in my work, we always talk about the technical aspects, and we've also with regulators on very much on technical aspects. Now we are looking very much on the trade aspect, which is very interesting. And I'll first start with sharing my slide on, I guess there's no surprises to everyone that, the electrical electronics devices, they are the world largest traded products in the world. It's even higher than energy and even vehicles. So no surprise, that's why this annex is so important. And if you look at the in ASEAN itself, again, it's also the top traded goods in ASEAN with the world, and also within ASEAN itself. This once again shows the importance, and that leads me now to the scope of the IEC. So I'm so pleased that I hear about the mention on Annex 4, that really everything that is covered by the IEC, or rather in Annex 4 is covered by the IEC. So if you look at the scope here of the IEC, as long as there's a need for electricity, there's a need for IEC standards. So we cover everything from the generation of energy through renewable sources like wind energy, solar, and so on, right up to the transmission distribution of the energy and to your homes and everything connected to it. So there was mentioned about electrical vehicle, household appliances, consumer electronics. These are all covered by IEC standards. And for that, we do a lot in supporting innovation in terms of new products coming to the market. We also support a lot of infrastructure development. So our standards are really the basis for all the infrastructure you see in the power system, and of course in smart cities, in electrical vehicle, and so on, and energy efficiency. So really the scope is wide, and I'd like to again share about us. We are not a organization where the members is by companies or individuals, but by countries. So in IC, the setup is such that membership is only by countries. And you can see here we have got 174 countries now in the IEC. So it's practically almost every country in the world. And for those countries who are still not in the IEC family, we are actively reaching out to them to be part of the IEC family. And as you can see here, we have got regional centers from around the world to support the IEC membership. Okay, from the IEC membership, I'd like to focus a bit on what is mentioned about WTO and international standardization. I think that has been very well explained now by James and Luis. So I wouldn't go too much into that, but I'd like to assure once again that the principles of how IEC develop our standards is based on what the WTO wants, in terms of transparency, openness, impartiality, and so on. So if you go to the IEC website, you can find information on the development of our standards, what stage they are at, and so on. So this is very open system that we have. And of course, we also address the concerns of developing countries. That's why if you see my earlier slide, I mentioned about IEC members and affiliates. So affiliates are countries who are given access to IEC standards, yes. And so what we do is really we help developing countries to have access to use standards and to even be able to comment on standards, international standards as well. So then I move on to this very important topic on harmonization. We heard many speakers mentioning about this, and I would just like to share a bit on some of the developments around in Asia and of course in the EU itself. So in ASEAN itself, they have what we call ASEAN Harmonized Regulatory Regime for electronic equipment. There's something that's in progress now. And the good news is that the reference standards that they look at when they look at the implementation of this regime is to look at IC standards as the first choice, as a reference standard. And sometimes they may make national deviation of it. Of course, we really encourage that people do not make deviation to the standards, but use identically what the IC has. And even in APEC, where things are voluntary, we do see a lot of alignment program as well. They've got a voluntary alignment program where, again, they put out IEC, ISO standards, where the APEC economies are encouraged to align their national standards to these standards. So there's a lot of activities going on in terms of harmonization. And this has started years ago. Oh, sorry, back again. And one thing I'd like to highlight also is the Frankfurt Agreement with Senelec. So this is quite interesting. And before Europe to start on the new standards, normally they come to the IEC first, to deal with the standard. And because of that, there's a lot of very good European involvement in the development of IEC standards. And as mentioned by Louis, about 80% of standards in the electronic space are actually identical standards, to IEC between the what you call EN standards. And we have an agreement now with Senelec such that for standards that we ever developed from 2018 and later, they will also come with the IEC in the prefix of the standards, so that people know that its relationship to international standards. Otherwise, if you look at the standard EN standards, you will think it's European, but actually most of them are identical adoption of the IEC standards. For South Asia, yeah, they are progressing a little slowly, but they are also starting to look into this harmonization aspect. And of course, they are also referring to IEC standards in their work. All right. And so having said that, so I hope this has shown that the advantages of using IEC standards, whether you are a manufacturer or regulator, is because of the process we have, and that because our standards are widely adopted, it means that your product can be recognized globally. And many regulators around the world refer to IEC standards or their national adoptions of the IEC standards, for their regulation. And what this has given is has given lots of confidence as well, to the manufacturers and regulators. Next. So I covered a bit on standards. Now I'd like to move on very quickly on testing and certification. So we mentioned a lot on conformity assessment procedures, and so on. But really, sometimes it can be something that is very helpful to companies. If imagine you are a small and medium-sized enterprise, if you want people to trust your product to be safe, what better way than to use an international, procedure that is recognized internationally, so as to give confidence on your products. So for IC, what we do is we have a very good system where not only are we using one standard, one test, and one certification, but the key thing is we want many countries to accept it. So really, it's not like because you meet one country needs, you need to have the product tested. What happens is that this will allow multiple countries to accept your product just through one testing. So this is something that we have in IC. It's third party, and I'll like to go to the next slide, which show you a list of the kind of conformity assessment systems that we have. So really it covers a very wide scope here, and I guess many of the products in Annex will be covered in here as well. All right, and finally, I'll go to my last presentation. As we can see from the previous presenter, we know that the EU and Singapore, and even ASEAN, they have very different approach to regulations. In EU, is from directive approach. So it's like every product, like low voltage products are all covered and regulated, although it's in a self-declaration kind of approach. But in ASEAN countries, many of them actually, they choose selected product to be regulated. So others, so maybe out of thousands of products, they only regulated 10 or 20 or whatever. So it's very much on product-based regulation rather than specific product-based regulation rather than a broad spectrum of products that are regulated. So that's a bit different. But the key thing is, regardless, international standards is like the language, common language among them. And And I think we'd like to encourage all our members, to come together to develop a standard so that they can adopt a standard, the IC standard that is identical and without any deviation. I think that will be something that would really facilitate trade. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dennis. You introduced us and reconfirmed a number of points, but I like particularly the slogan "One Standard, One Test, One Certification." I think that captures it. You also highlighted the interplay between trade rules and the standardization work of the organizations. At some point, you stressed that the WTO sort of principles are being followed by the international standardizing organizations. I think that's an interesting example of how these things really cross-fertilize. And I think this is why we're here today, because the EUSFTA is a milestone in quite a number of ways, but also in this interplay between trade rules and the regulatory challenges from product safety to management of electromagnetic spectrum and components generally. So all of that was encapsulated. Thank you so much. We have time for a brief Q&A. You are all encouraged to put your questions into the chat, but maybe I will abuse my privilege here and turn to Luis Miguel. Luis Miguel, a provocative question. Are the electronics annexes in EU FTAs, such as here in Singapore, a success? And perhaps more gently looking into the future, are there aspects that you see potentially evolving in the future? And while we're at it, let me just add another aspect here that was stressed when we talk about one standard, one test, one certification. As was hinted at before, we have the notion that conformity assessment is also, or can be, trade in services by laboratory testing and certification agencies. How do you see the EU conformity assessment industry, if you like, positioned here, thinking of Singapore, but also ASEAN and the rest of the world? I know that's a mouthful, so pick and choose whatever comes best to you.
Thank you very much, Hannes, for these questions. The first one with respect to the results, the outcome of the FTA, I would dare to say that any FTA provides with added value to the enterprises, because the purpose is basically to reduce administrative burdens. So in general, I would dare to say that yes, it has been a success. There is a lot of things to do. There is a lot of things to improve, because it is a continuous work. But in general terms, if we see the figures, we can see that there have been a clear improvement in the exports and imports. So yeah, I would dare to say that it has been a success. With respect to the elements that will potentially evolve in the future, I would like to refer to a previous comment from James on radio standards. This is very relevant because, as I said before, more and more we are facing products with radio capabilities, with wireless capabilities. So it means that radio standards will have to be applied. And it is true that the development of standards for radio matters at the international level is not so consolidated as for other sectors, as for other files. And this is, I think, the real challenge we have. There is a good example, which is 3GPP. It's a partnership between different standardization organizations all over the world for standardizing the network, the different generations of cellular networks, 5G, or even 6G, then the next one. And this is something that we need to foster from the public authorities perspective. Let me also refer to the recently adopted standardization strategy, which the Commission has been adopted in the previous days. And one of the main purposes of that is to foster the participation of the local companies to leverage in the international development of standards. This is something that has been also referred by Dennis. And finally, with respect to the services, one of the main challenges we can mention here is the cybersecurity, because more and more we understand that products and services are two different things that are linked. So in the future, we are not having any more products by one side and services by the other side. So we need to put it together. In the European Union, we are reviewing the new legislative framework, which is the horizontal framework for placing products on the market. And we are also working in terms of cybersecurity on what we call the Cyber Resilience Act, which will be a common framework for both products and services in order to ensure a certain level of cybersecurity. So in my view, and all in all, these would be the main elements to be taken into consideration for the evolution of this FTA.
Okay, thank you, Luis Miguel. I gave you a big list and you came back with a bigger list. Jun-Hong, you and James both referred to the fact that the list of controlled goods is being reviewed, is subject to review every 5 years. The last time we had a review, you stressed it was 2018. I assume it's perhaps too early to go into any detail, but if we were to look ahead, what could we expect from the upcoming review? Perhaps both in terms of substance, but also in terms of process. Are we going to see more self-declarations, less third-party conformity assessments, perhaps?
That's a very good question, Hana-san, and you really put me in the spot here. but as part of our commitment to do the 5 years review, we are actually kickstarting the process of the review right now. We are actually taking an earnest look into the list. I cannot commit, nor can I really tell you in details what's going to happen. Sure. But if you look at the trajectory in the past, from time before the EU FTA, as part of our negotiations, and then in the 2018 review, the trajectory has been always the case that we will try to reduce or even to move them to either the post-market surveillance or the supplier declaration of conformity kind of regime. So I do hope and I do expect that we move along the same trajectory going forward, where things become lower risk in the sense, based on our assessment, we will start moving them to a simpler kind of conformity procedures, or even to remove them entirely. I think that is really in our mind right now, and the review is ongoing. We will see what we can do. But the second part of the idea that I wanted to also highlight is that, in terms of these procedures and things like that, beyond just the substance, beyond what kind of product categories are we trying to reduce, we are also making sure that, the softer aspect or the non-substance aspect of it is also simpler for businesses and companies. In the sense, you can do it through electronic means, or even that, the information and very clearly what goes into the requirement and what don't go into the requirement, and what we require out of these whole procedures are very clear, very consistent, and very transparent to companies on the website that we have. So there are two aspects of it. We are really trying to see whether or not we can also review with a view to bring it down. And also the other aspect is how can we make it even simpler for company to really try to go about fulfilling such requirements. Yep.
Thank you so much. I'm keen not to rock the timetable too early today. So Dennis and James, allow me to move on. We'll still maybe have time at the end to come back to a few points. So thank you very much, Luis Miguel, Jun-Hong, Dennis, and James for this first round. Again, before we proceed to the next discussion, let me remind everybody the Q&A is open. Any remarks, any questions, most welcome in the Q&A bar below the screen or at the bottom of the screen. Now to our third part of this webinar. What does the intended beneficiary, namely business, think? Wolfgang, Germany is not only the biggest member state, but correct me if I'm wrong, also the biggest player when it comes to electronics. Many things play together here: research and development, design, production, trade and investment. Singapore plays a central role for the electronics industry in all of these areas, and vice versa. Thanks for sharing your perspectives here today. You are the CEO of EUSFTA, the Electro and Digital Industry Association in Germany. Thank you very much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Hannes, indeed, for having me on behalf of the industry. And thanks to you and the other organizers for also setting this very interesting conference up. I also learned a few new things just myself over the last 1 hour. No, many thanks indeed. In general, the view about Singapore always has been very positive in European business. Singapore has, which one of our company CEOs recently said that Singapore is always part of the solution, never part of the problem. Also, when it comes to look further into the role of Singapore as a hub into the ASEAN region, and some of the other colleagues talked about this in the first part. So what I would like to start with maybe is to give more recent figures, actually, because we have more recent figures from 2021. Not for the whole of Europe, but for the trade between Germany and Singapore. And Hannes, you were talking about the relative weight of German industry within Europe. And roughly we can say that there's a ratio between 1 and 3. So roughly the German, in our scope, which is slightly different from what the other colleagues have used, in our scope, our 2021 figures show that we have reached exactly 200 billion euros of production as the German electro and digital industry, and roughly 600 billion is the figure for the Europe, so for the EU. So that is roughly, so that you can compare notes, this ratio of 1 to 3. And now the 2021 figures are the following. It shows that the export of Germany to Singapore has increased by 16% from 2020 to 21. 2020, of course, has been a certain special year in terms of Corona, but also if we look and compare to the growth from 2018 to 2019, this was 2.6%. 2.6% back then, and last year, and then in the 2020, we had only a reduction of 1.8%. So the 16.1% is not just a base effect based on Corona, but there must be more than that to this really interesting figure. When it comes to imports from Singapore to Germany, while still there has been a slow decline by 0.4%, 2021 compared to 2020. This is still much, much better than what we have seen between 2018 and 2019, when the decline was 8.5%. So I think these figures show that indeed trade is increasing, and certainly we should also look positively also from that angle to the EUSFTA. Of course, also before we know that, and I just talked about this one quote, Singapore always has been a very positive country to do trade with, to do business with. But right now with the EUSFTA, and in particular with the Annex, we see interesting perspectives. So just to give you two examples what this can mean in reality, if we look at lithium batteries, we see that there is constant trade going on. They are sent from Germany to Singapore, from Singapore further to Indonesia, then upgraded, sent back to Germany, or semiconductors, another important example, and this was also referred to earlier. We see that, you know, producing a semiconductor in this rather globalized industry means that they are being sent back and forth, and in particular between Singapore and Malaysia and Germany, this we looked into some examples, can mean that certain intermediate steps go back and forth up to 8 times between those regions, and this of course now made much easier. We heard a lot about the annex and about the procedures with which companies can comply with local regulatory requirements, and this of course is the key challenge for our industry. We want to stick to highest standards so that those examples that were mentioned before will not really happen. It was great to hear how much the willingness is there from both parties to live up to the expectations that the negotiators have put into the annex. And that, of course, is now the big question. How will this develop further? How will the annex be implemented? And if I may, I would just then ask to both Junhong and Luis Miguel, then please also work further on your roadmaps to facilitate the implementation even further. And to make this more concrete, then of course to Junhong, our wish, our expectations would be that indeed in the review that is up then in 2024 and that you are up to start right now, yes, please continue with what you started in 2018 to reduce the list of, as you put it, controlled categories and switch more over to this self-declaration of suppliers. This would be really fantastic because obviously the EUSFTA has a huge role to play also for other free trade agreements that, if I look now from the European perspectives, should be adopted between the EU and many, many more countries and regions. And the request to Luis Miguel would be, we heard so much just right now also from Dennis about the huge importance and the readiness of industry to work along the IEC, but also about along the other two international standardization organizations, the readiness to work on international standards. And our huge request to you and your colleagues in the Commission is to make deviations between the European harmonized standards and the international standards as small as possible. We have with much sympathy seen the standardization strategy that you have just alluded to, Luis Miguel, which really shows a great potential. I think sets the right philosophy that the NLF should be continued and that harmonized standards should be worked out by more cooperation between industry and the Commission services, including the Commission harmonized consultants, what is often referred to as the HAS consultants. So our request would be, please help us to ensure that while these harmonized standards are worked out, there is a smooth, continuous exchange between Commission services, the HAS consultants, and industry, that the harmonized standards do not deviate from the international standards. And if we make sure that this happens together with what Junhong suggests, or he didn't commit to anything, but where he said, well, I understand that you are ready to work with your teams to make an ambitious review 2024. I think this is a fantastic blueprint for many, many other FTAs that should be worked out. And maybe a last request to bring this even to somewhat higher levels. Of course, we see as European industry with certain concern that free trade agreements for political reasons are more and more overloaded by really completely non-trade policy issues. While I understand that this team today, our setup is not sufficient to address those concerns appropriately, still I would like to send out this request to all those online. Please help us in our mutual interest to make more free trade agreements possible, in particular like those ones as this blueprint EUSFTA. Thank you very much, and back to you, Johannes.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. Some more homework thrown there to the two governments present here today, not to their surprise, I suspect, because that is indeed where we need to go. I heard some further calls for harmonization and, of course, some expectations for review. Wolfgang, thank you so much, and thanks to the German electronics industry to be here in force today. Chris, the ICC is a key contributor to business input on all matters trade, really, across the board. You, of course, have your favorite or your more concentrated projects. You yourself are part of the ICC's Digital Standards Initiative. Give us your view on what we are discussing here today, and if you need to spread out a little bit into other aspects, just to highlight the connections, feel free to do so. We're a tiny bit tight on time, so but I know you're good at keeping yourself fast. Thanks. Go ahead.
I'll do my best to keep it short and concise. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. It's really interesting listening to the speakers. Wolfgang, many of the points that Wolfgang was making there are absolutely in line with what we're saying. So just from my perspective, you know, I'm coming at this from the sort of the broad landscape perspective, and what can we do to make trade cheaper, faster, simpler, and importantly, increase access to finance and increase SME participation. And of course, looking through the lens of the electronics industries, all of those aspects and priorities are really, really important. So when I talk about standards, this is important. So when I talk about standards, I'm talking about digital standards in the context of the trade ecosystem. So I'm not talking about electronic standards, but harmonized standards is 100% the kind of space that we want to be advocating. So what are the barriers to trade in the sort of trading ecosystem? And this applies just as much to electronics businesses as it does to anybody else. Anybody shipping goods across borders feels the pain of fragmented, antiquated trade systems, digital islands, systems and processes that don't talk or connect to each other between government and private sector to private sector. And what does that mean? That means that the trade costs are unsustainably high and could be much lower. And we can't scale technology solutions across borders because laws don't allow us to. We can't digitalize the ecosystem like we want to. But if we digitalize the trade ecosystem. Just to give you a flavor of the kind of gains we're talking about here, the prize is huge. We did a business case study of the G7 and what would be the outcome of digitalizing trade documents, commercial trade documents in particular. And what that study told us is it would deliver 9 trillion in additional trade growth, 6 trillion in additional new SME exports, an 80% reduction in trade transaction costs, and a 50% cut in the trade finance gap. Those numbers are absolutely enormous. And if you scale that worldwide, you can start to see just how big those numbers are. It's the biggest transformation program in world trade. But what do we need to make happen in order to realize those gains for all companies, and in this context, the electronics industries, is we need governments to update legal frameworks to enable companies to handle trade documents, particularly commercial trade documents, bills of exchange, bills of lading, warehouse receipts, those sort of documents in digital form, and then to align legal frameworks to what's called the UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records, the MLETR it's called. And then I'll come to the standards aspect of this as well in terms of adopting interoperable standards. Now, in the context of EU, Singapore is interesting because Singapore has already done this. So Singapore is aligned, but the EU is not. And so the focus really now needs to be on supporting the EU to accelerate work in this space, to align itself to the MLETR alongside Singapore so that the whole trade corridor can be fully digitalized. That's really, really important. Around the standards side, what we really want is, or the solutions to this fragmentation issue is a standardized approach. That's about adopting open, interoperable standards across all the trade transaction activities, across all parties. The ICC is about to publish a standards map for corporates and SMEs in the next few weeks, and that sets out the internationally agreed digital trade standards across the whole trade ecosystem. What standard needs to be applied in what part of the ecosystem? Singapore are already working on this and about how to apply those standards into the trade transaction space. And again, we really need the opportunity here is for the EU to do the same. So you get this end-to-end benefit. The UK, by the way, where I'm based, is also actively working on this space and aligning rules and testing and piloting activities between the two. So, my call to action here really is to ask for your support and help to work with, particularly the EU in this case. I think this is an incredible opportunity. Singapore is really at the center of all of this worldwide. It's the leader without any question of a doubt. And it's really the onus is on us on the European side to catch up a bit with that and then enable the electronics industry to really benefit from all those gains, and of course wider industry benefits too. So that's my kind of call to action, and I think that's very supportive to the messaging you're hearing today around harmonized standards, about making trade easier, about removing barriers. This is just another swathe of those same issues, but in the context of those trade transactions from buyer to seller to shipper to customs, that space, we can really reduce the pain points and just make life cheaper, faster, and simpler. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. You moved us a bit further from electronics trade to electronics and trade, and I think that's well deserved in many ways, because of course electronics do, as we heard in various shapes and forms today, they underpin everything, but for a reason. We need them for just about everything today. Another thing that I found important here is the call for a standardized approach to transactions, which is a sister to the standardized approach to goods and their certification and testing, etc., conformity assessment. So I'm looking forward to that ICC standards map, I have to say. So lots of things to go for. In the interest of optimized management today, let me bring in Eugene immediately for his presentation, and then have our Q&A. I think it fits beautifully. So let us do this. Thanks for going immediately, Eugene, again, also to you the call to keep it succinct so that we have a little bit of space afterwards. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Hannes. So I'm just going to touch on, I'll try to pull together quite a few threads that have been covered by the various speakers today, but really to look at how Singapore and ASEAN can be the center of global value chains, and also to share my perspectives about how companies have been structuring themselves and organizing themselves to make the best use of the market access that's afforded by the various FTAs. So firstly, in terms of Singapore and ASEAN at the center of global value chains, I'd like to start really with the ASEAN Economic Community 2025 Blueprint, where they're among its various ambitious goals. Two of the key ones are, one, to enhance participation in global value chains, and two, global ASEAN. So in terms of enhancing participation in global value chains, I think ASEAN is looking at deeper regional integration to better realize economies of scale and collective efficiencies. So really saying, hey, look, if we can make ASEAN a highly integrated region, then businesses that operate within the region, across borders within the region, they're able to really harness the economies of scale when you sort of bring the 10 countries in ASEAN together as one. Secondly, in terms of global ASEAN, it really touches on some of the other themes that have been discussed earlier, but where ASEAN as a whole looks at enhancing its connectivity with the rest of the world through FTAs and comprehensive economic partnership agreements. So really, if you look at these two developments, ASEAN is saying we want to be the center of global value chains, and once you're able to have greater integration, then you're able to look at companies are able to look at the different comparative advantages of ASEAN and look at integrating that into a coherent corporate strategy. So if we look at the next slide, please. Thank you. If you look at the way in which ASEAN also has been, and Singapore has been sort of increasing its ability to tap on regional global markets, I really like to look at its multifaceted, multi-channeled approach towards creating greater connectivity for trade in goods. And to your point, Hannes, also trade in services. But if you look at interregional, Singapore is very much an active participant in the various interregional free trade agreement type of discussions, such as the CPTPP, the ASEAN-EU initiatives, the ASEAN-Canada negotiations. And I think what we're going to see is that ASEAN will try as a bloc to now negotiate ambitious free trade agreements with countries outside the Asia-Pacific region. Secondly, within the Asia-Pacific region itself, ASEAN has pursued very aggressive regional type of FTA initiatives, such as the ASEAN +6, ASEAN +1, and within Southeast Asia itself, having the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement and the ASEAN Trade in Services Agreement. So there, among the ASEAN countries, as well as between ASEAN and the rest of the Asia-Pacific nations, you've got very robust FTA negotiations initiatives there. Then on a bilateral basis, you see that Singapore and actually various countries in Southeast Asia have embarked on very ambitious bilateral FTA programs. So for example, Singapore has the free trade agreement with the EU, but likewise, the EU also has a free trade agreement with Vietnam and is pursuing negotiations with Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand. And also moving beyond just the classical free trade agreement type of negotiations, countries, Singapore has been pursuing digital economic partnership agreements with various countries around the world. And certainly, I think the one with the EU is on the cards as well. So if you look at all these various agreements, what you see is that Singapore and ASEAN have pursued a multi-tracked approach to expanding economic relationships with key trading partners. But what this means for businesses and companies is that you have a greater diversity of trade agreement conduits to incorporate into your supply chain structures. Now, in terms of how do you look at organizing the various manufacturing and distribution operations in Southeast Asia and in the Asia Pacific region? Again, I think there are two things to consider from a trade in goods and movement of goods perspective. Firstly, you look at the incentive regimes, and we've talked about the very favorable incentive regimes in Singapore, but certainly in Thailand, Malaysia, China, etc. Also a lot of grants where governments will support companies that look to invest in business activities that contribute to their economic goals, such as skills training, attracting the R&D activity, pioneer in industries, etc. But I think it's important to note that there are certain global developments, such as the base erosion profit shifting project in the OECD, that may erode some of the attractiveness of some of these incentive and grant regimes for multinationals. And there, I think, is important to ensure that any type of investment strategy takes into account a scenario where you don't really have the benefits of the existing incentive and grants, and whether that continues to be a viable business proposition. On top of that, it's important to note outside FTA, outside these incentive and grant regimes, you also have inward processing and free trade zone regimes that allow you to move goods into a country for manufacturing, for export overseas, without having to incur customs duty costs, and also to ensure that you're able to achieve cash flow savings by duty deferral structures by using bonded trading arrangements. So including all of that is going to be important into structuring and organizing for businesses to ensure that they've got highly efficient supply chain structures. Now, I'd just like to add that the devil is always in the details. So when you look at, be it free trade agreements or the use of free trade agreements or the use of these inward processing or free trade zone regimes, the devil is always in the details. It's important to ensure that your type of manufacturing is ideal for the regime they're seeking to use. So for example, some of these inward processing arrangements may not be ideal for high mix, low volume manufacturing and vice versa. I've just added here a slide about how we see companies organizing themselves, and if looking at using ASEAN and Asia Pacific as looking at it as an integrated economic unit, and how Singapore can be used to the benefit of European electronic companies. But certainly I think here you have Singapore often being used as the situs for regional headquarter functions to do management, sales and distribution, procurement, R&D, financing. And from Singapore, the team here then looks at procurement of supplies and components, and that can be from Asia, from EU, global procurement type activity can be run out of Singapore. The sale and purchase of these raw materials can be done through Singapore as the centralized procurement and invoicing entity. They then engage manufacturing entities around the region in lower cost. Well, again, if you're sort of in certain types of manufacturing activities like semiconductor, maybe Singapore is a place to put your manufacturing activities. But if it's more white goods, consumer electronic type of manufacturing, then perhaps China or Philippines or Indonesia could be where you want to put your manufacturing, and that can be done on a contract manufacturing on a contract manufacturing basis, and the finished products are then procured from the manufacturing entities, and those could then be on-sold to markets both in the Asia Pacific region as well as to the EU and the rest of the world. And that is where, again, you have free trade agreements between Singapore and between the region and these various target markets that enable companies to bring in their products at reduced landed cost. So that's really sort of a very, very quick overview of how companies have made use of FTAs to organize themselves. Now, I'd just like to add that there are obviously continuing challenges for companies operating in the region. And when you think about coming up with an efficient supply chain, it's important to note that there are certain developments that you need to keep an eye out for. We've talked about compliance, and here I think really sometimes the number of overlapping FTAs can cause more problems than solutions. So especially dealing with certificates of origin and managing the certificates of origin, and how sometimes if you use hubbing locations in certain localities, that might actually take you away from disqualify a product from duty preference because of direct shipment rules or because of the inability to match back-to-back certificates of origin. So compliance needs to be really looked at when you're looking at putting in place an efficient supply chain that seeks to make use of these FTAs that governments have negotiated. Secondly, I think more broadly, I think coming out of COVID, I think you see a lot of businesses now look at supply chain resilience as being one of the anchor points to their manufacturing strategies. And there, I think increasingly companies are looking at chopping up their highly centralized and long supply chains to shorter and more resilient supply chains. And we are looking to move manufacturing closer to markets and to look at dual, triple source your raw materials. So all this really needs to be, again, mapped out in terms of how the need for centralization and creation of that highly efficient supply chain conflicts with perhaps some of the other countervailing strategic goals. Then I think we wanted to also talk a bit about audit wave, and certainly one of the things around the last 2 years has been governments have dug deep into their coffers to support businesses with a lot of programs to support them through COVID. And obviously that's come at great cost to national treasuries. And I think the anticipation is that there are going to be a lot more audits coming down the pipeline. And certainly I think from a free trade perspective, I think as your general MFN duty rates come down, and where companies are now looking at FTAs to get those duty rates down to zero, I think what we anticipate is that there are going to be a lot more origin verifications. And therefore, if you do wish to use FTAs, it's important to ensure that you have robust compliance programs to be able to withstand audit scrutiny. And the last piece is around international developments. I talked about the OECD and international tax developments and the impact on the attractiveness of incentive and grants. I'll just add another couple more, one more very important international development, which has seismic waves that ripple through the global trading system, and that's really the continued China-US trade tensions. And again, how that will shape the supply chain structures remains to be seen. But I do think countries or regions like ASEAN and the EU will stand to gain as businesses start to seek neutral locations to site more of their supply operations in order to avoid the direct being in the direct conflict of the US-China trade tensions. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Hannes.
Thank you so much, Eugene. Another tour de force, and I think the good news is we have a lot more to discuss than we have time for today. That I think is just reflects just how important and big this is. So, gentlemen, yes, we do have a gender balance problem today, and we definitely need to do better next time. I would like to invite all of you, as we are running out of time, to offer any last comments you had. I would like to go first with Wolfgang and Chris. Perhaps this is the continuation of the business session, if you like, but at the same time also ask Luis, Miguel, and of course Jun Hong to maybe prepare for responding to some of those additional comments we heard, if you like. And of course, Dennis and James, you will be most welcome to then come in as well. So everybody, if you can keep it to 1 minute each, that would be spectacular. Thank you very much. Wolfgang, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks, Hannes. Again, I find this a fantastic blueprint FTA. I would like to also comment briefly on Chris's proposal about, standardizing digital product and trade documents. The EU is working on what they call the product pass. Actually, we are running certain pilot projects to standardize digital nameplates for products that could also use then and encompass then certain products. At the same time, Luis Miguel, please allow, the Commission should not overdo these things. Very often then they ask for more and more and more questions that suppliers, manufacturers should provide. And then, of course, the whole thing will become, again, too complicated if we think about the SCIP database and what you all have. So my request to you now, being the representative of the Commission here, of course, now a bit broader thinking of the Commission, please keep that in balance. And then I would be really interested to hear later then from you, but again, also from Yun Hong, in terms of my earlier requests, also to make sure that you further live up to the expectations that you have put up in the annex. Thank you very much again, Hannes, for this very interesting session.
Chris, I'm tempted to let you choose now or later.
No, I'll go now. I mean, I think this has been a terrifically interesting session. I think this FTA discussion couldn't come at a better time. I think this is a really unique opportunity to really strip out an awful lot of unnecessary cost and inefficiency, both from a sectoral point of view and from a sort of a cross-cutting trade transaction point of view. And all I would say is, look, let's grab the opportunity. Let's work together, work with our governments, particularly at the EU end, I think, where more attention is needed. And really make this happen. We couldn't have a better trade partner than Singapore in this space. They really are out front as a leader. It's just an amazing opportunity for everyone. So let's just grab it with both hands and really make it happen. It's really there for us to take.
Thanks so much, Chris. Jun Hong, I'd like you to go next if okay. I did hear rules of origin mentioned, but the floor is yours.
No rules of origin today. You overcomplicate matter. No, but I just want to quickly respond to I think what Wolfgang said in terms of the expectation. Like I mentioned, I think we are committed to working with the EU counterpart as well as our regulators to ensure that we move forward in the right direction. To ensure that it becomes easier, faster, cheaper for companies to trade. I think the EU's presence in terms of electronics, especially consumer electronics, is huge already in Singapore. Just a little fun fact, I just moved house, and when I was going out to get the household electronic products, you have the Bosch, you have a lot of different companies, big companies here in Singapore. But of course, we are always committed to helping companies trade easily to Singapore. I think the consumer variety, preference, and things like that are always important to us as well. And just also to quickly respond to Chris, I think in terms of the work that ICC does, looking forward to the paper. Actually, I think Chris itself will know that Singapore is part of the governance board. G9 is there. We are working very closely with G9 in terms of all these digital standards, and we are always looking for opportunities to work even closer together in terms of the initiative, how you're going to go about doing the standards, digital standard, ensuring that the trade corridor is digitalized. So I'm looking forward to the paper itself. And thank you so much for the views that was offered by Wolfgang as well as Chris. I don't want to hold up the time for Luis Miguel. I'll pass it to Luis Miguel to see whether or not he has anything else to add. Thank you.
Luis Miguel.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a final reaction from my side. As you know, the European Union is committed with this FTA and with the evolution of it in order to reduce the administrative burdens for our industries and of course, for the Singaporean industries. We are very much concerned on the difficulties of the supply chain and the shortage we have all over the world. This is something that unfortunately is not restricted to these two territories. It has a lot of geopolitical components, and there are a lot of initiatives launched by the Commission. Recently, the CHIPS Act, the standardization strategy, as I touched upon before. And we are continuously working in order to improve it. With respect to the standards, I would like to refer to the Wolfgang comment before. The Commission is pretty much concerned about the situation of the standards, especially for radio equipment. What we want is to increase the participation of our industries in the development of the standards. In our view, this is something essential, that our companies participate in the international fora in order to set our values and defend our industries in both territories, both in the European Union and in Singapore. So I would encourage all the participants here to participate and to foster the presence of our industries in this international fora. This is essential in our view. Finally, just a quick remark with respect to the publication of harmonized standards. This is something that we want to do in a smooth way, trying to do it as quick as possible. But let me also tell you that we need to assess the standards so that we can verify that they fulfill with the legal requirements. Harmonized standards and the standards in general are developed by let's say private organizations, the standardization organizations, and the presence of the public sector is important here because we will need to ensure that the legal requirements are valued. In the case of the European Union, the harmonized standards are part of the EU legal framework. They are not external elements, they take part of our legislation. And in this respect, they should comply with our essential requirements. This is essential, and we are working very closely with the standardization organization, with the European standardization organization in particular. But I think this is, we are all in the same boat, and it is in our interest to be able to publish the standards as soon as we can. Nothing else from my side. Many thanks for the organization of this webinar, and thanks again for letting us participate in it. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis Miguel. Dennis, a few last words from you.
Yes, I mean, what struck to me is really this theme on harmonization. So really, as Wolfgang mentioned and Luis Miguel mentioned, please come in, join in, participate in international standards, and let there be no deviations if we can. Thanks.
Thanks. James, over to you.
Very briefly, it's interesting to hear from all of these speakers, but one point that I want to emphasize, I think also that the EUSFTA is really a very good platform to further cooperation between Singapore and the EU as regards the development of other standards in the future. Particularly for, I see that there will be challenges as regards new technology, especially given that artificial intelligence is getting more important and being embedded in a lot of electronic products. So that is an area that could definitely be something that can be a point of cooperation for both the EU and Singapore in the future.
Thank you, James. Eugene?
I thank you, Hannes, for pulling together such a diverse set of speakers, and it never fails to amaze me how trade is so multifaceted, and we have so many different stakeholders in the global trade game, and how everyone's really contributing as key stakeholders to really helping businesses get work more efficiently. And speaking from the role of an advisor that has helped various companies on their supply chain type of operations for probably close to over 2 decades now, I think all these different initiatives really do help businesses ensure that they continue to be highly efficient and provide consumers with their products in a very, very cost-effective way. So thank you for all your efforts. I guess what I'll do is perhaps tee this, maybe sort of provide a little bit of a teaser for our future webinars, where I think we've talked about all these issues in the context of the EU-Singapore FTA, but I think it's also important to note that the work that's been done between the two governments really starts to set a standard and a bar for other FTAs that the EU will conclude with its trading partners in the region. And really, I think we hope to see that there will be greater connectivity between the various Asia-Pacific countries and the EU, really as a way to augment the already strong economic relationships between the various countries.
Thank you very much, Eugene. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for this. For our closing remarks, I would like to introduce now Mrs. Justina Lasik, the head of the EU delegation's Economic and Trade section, and really the head behind all of this effort. Justina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I think a lot has been said, so I'm not going to repeat the conclusions that colleagues reached. I would like to just basically say that we have now a full list of points that we have to definitely follow up on with our Singaporean counterparts. Obviously, FTA is just a starting point, so we are not looking only at the implementation of FTA, but also what we can go do to intensify this cooperation. Definitely, what was the clear takeaway from today was the importance of standardization and ensuring that the standards are not only compatible between two parties, but globally. And this is where convergence of standards is important, and the role of international bodies is very, very crucial in this process. I also wanted to refer to what Chris said, and actually, and I think that digitalization overall is something where Singapore is very strong at. Singapore completed several of digital economy agreements with several countries, actually mainly in this region. Asia-Pacific region, and also EU decided to launch such discussions with several countries in the Indo-Pacific region based on our strategy that was adopted last year. We have already launched this process with South Korea and Japan, and we are actually in the process of starting it with Singapore. In fact, in December of last year, we had the first trade committee under the free trade agreement with Singapore, and digitalization of trade was one of the key points that was discussed there. So definitely the recommendation of Chris to move to more digitalization is there, and we are definitely trying to catch up and evolve on this. So we will follow up with further events. This is fifth of our series of 7 events, so we have 2 more to go to explain other aspects of the FTA. But to conclude today's event, as we are already running over time, let me thank again all the speakers for your time invested into preparation and also to participate in our seminar today. Also to Hannes for moderation and our technical team to support that was able to support the organization. We will be informing you about future events via our website and Twitter and YouTube channels. And if you would like to listen to any parts of this event, we will also provide the recording and the presentations. So we will be sending email to everyone with the links to our YouTube channel and our website. So if you would want to share it with anyone else who couldn't listen today, or you would want to rewatch certain parts, you are welcome to do so. So thank you very much for this very interesting discussion, and let me wish you a nice rest of the day. Thank you very much.